Your blood sugar is probably spiking right now, not because you just finished a chocolate bar or a bowl of ice cream, not because you ate something you know you should not have. It might be spiking because of things you eat every single day that carry a health halo, things that have been marketed to you for decades as safe, smart, and balanced choices, things your doctor has probably never told you to avoid. Blood glucose is not just a concern for people with diabetes. It is a moment-to-moment signal that determines how much fat your body stores, how inflamed your arteries become, how well your brain functions, and how fast or how slowly you age at a cellular level. Every time your glucose spikes sharply and crashes back down, you are setting off a chain of hormonal events that touch virtually every system in your body. The conventional story is straightforward. Eat sugar, glucose rises. Eat less sugar, glucose stays stable. Avoid sweets, avoid the problem. Except that is not what is actually happening inside most people's bodies. Because the biggest glucose spikes of the day, the ones that cause the most long-term metabolic damage, are not always coming from sugar. They are coming from something far more unexpected. Something that millions of people eat confidently every single day because they have been told it is good for them. And once you understand what that is and why it works the way it does, you will never look at your meals the same way again. Hi, I am Dr. Alex. I am an emergency medicine doctor, and after nearly 10 years working on the front line of the AANDE, I have seen the end-stage consequences of metabolic disease up close. Type 2 diabetes, heart failure, kidney disease, strokes, conditions that often start decades earlier as a quiet, invisible pattern of glucose dysregulation that nobody caught in time. My goal now is to help people understand what is actually happening in their bodies before it reaches that point. If you are watching this, you are probably already paying attention to your health. Maybe you have had a blood test come back with concerning fasting glucose. Maybe you have been told you are pre-diabetic and you are trying to figure out what that actually means. Maybe you are just trying to understand why, despite eating what you think is a reasonably healthy diet, your energy crashes in the afternoon and your weight will not shift. I want to take just a moment here to make you a promise. I will keep making the most useful, most honest, most science-backed videos I possibly can to help you live longer and avoid the diseases I see in emergency medicine every day. All I ask in return is that you give this channel a chance and hit the subscribe button. If you get to the end of this video and you do not feel like you learned something genuinely valuable, then feel free to unsubscribe. No hard feelings whatsoever. But if you give me your time and your attention, I will give you everything I have learned from over a decade in medicine. Please hit subscribe to help this channel reach more people who need this information. And let us get into it. Before we can understand what is driving glucose spikes in people who are not eating obvious sugar, we need to understand what blood glucose actually does in the body and why keeping it stable is so much more important than most people realize. Every time you eat carbohydrates of any kind, those carbohydrates are broken down into glucose, a simple sugar, and absorbed into your bloodstream. Your blood glucose level rises, your pancreas detects that rise and releases insulin, the hormone responsible for moving glucose out of the blood and into your cells where it can be used for energy. When the system works correctly, this happens smoothly and efficiently. Glucose rises, insulin responds, glucose is cleared, and levels return to baseline within about an hour or two. That is normal, that is what the body was designed to do. The problem is what happens when that cycle is disrupted, when glucose rises too sharply, too often, or stays elevated for too long. In those circumstances, a cascade of damaging processes is set in motion. The first consequence is what researchers call glycation, a process where excess glucose molecules attach themselves to proteins and fats throughout the body. This damages blood vessel walls, stiffens arteries, impairs kidney function, and directly contributes to the kind of vascular disease that leads to heart attacks and strokes. Research published in Diabetology has shown that even people who are not diabetic but who experience frequent large glucose spikes show measurably accelerated arterial damage over time. The damage is not waiting for a diabetes diagnosis. It is accumulating quietly in people with entirely normal fasting glucose. The second consequence is chronic insulin elevation. Every spike in glucose demands an insulin response. When spikes are large and frequent, insulin is being released in large quantities repeatedly throughout the day. Over time, cells begin to respond less and less efficiently to insulin, a state called insulin resistance. The pancreas compensates by releasing even more insulin to achieve the same effect. Insulin stays chronically elevated, and chronically elevated insulin drives fat storage, particularly around the abdomen, promotes systemic inflammation, and significantly increases the risk of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and even certain cancers. The third consequence involves the brain. Glucose is the brain's primary fuel, and large swings in blood glucose, sharp spikes followed by crashes, create real, measurable cognitive effects. Brain fog, difficulty concentrating, low mood, afternoon energy crashes, and increased food cravings are all downstream effects of glucose instability. That is not a willpower problem, that is your brain responding to the fuel instability you have given it. So the stakes are high, and yet most of the conversation about blood glucose focuses almost exclusively on sugar. Avoid sweets, cut out fizzy drinks, do not eat too many biscuits. That advice is not wrong, it is just radically incomplete. Here is the part that most people have never been told, and it is the part that changes everything. The biggest glucose spikes are not always coming from obviously sweet foods. They are often coming from foods that most people and most standard dietary advice consider perfectly fine or even actively healthy. Let me take you through the main ones. The first and most significant hidden driver is refined starchy carbohydrates, white bread, white rice, standard pasta, crackers, bagels, breakfast cereals, even the ones marketed as whole grain or low sugar. These foods are composed primarily of rapidly digestible starch, which your digestive system converts into glucose almost as fast as pure table sugar. The glycemic index, a measure of how quickly a food raises blood glucose, of white bread is essentially equivalent to glucose itself. When you eat a large portion of white rice, a bowl of cornflakes, or 2 slices of toast, the glucose spike that follows is often steeper and faster than what you would get from a small chocolate bar. That is the first hidden driver, refined starch. The second is portion size combined with food combination. A moderate portion of pasta produces a manageable glucose response. A large portion of pasta with a piece of garlic bread and a glass of orange juice produces an enormous one. Not because any single item is particularly problematic in isolation, but because the total carbohydrate load lands in your bloodstream all at once. Research published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition has shown that total carbohydrate quantity is one of the strongest predictors of post-meal glucose response, independent of the type of carbohydrate consumed. The cumulative effect of multiple carbohydrate-heavy foods at a single meal is something most people have never been taught to think about. The third hidden driver is fruit juice and smoothies. This one surprises people more than almost anything else because fruit is widely understood to be healthy, and it is in its whole form. But when you juice fruit or blend it at high speed, you remove or destroy most of the fiber, and fiber is critical because fiber is what slows glucose absorption. Without it, the natural sugars in fruit, primarily fructose and glucose, enter the bloodstream rapidly. A 330 milliliters glass of orange juice contains approximately the same amount of sugar as 2 to 3 oranges, but delivers it in a matter of minutes rather than the 20 to 30 minutes it would take to eat and digest the whole fruit. The glucose spike that follows is substantial, and it often comes with the assumption that it is not only acceptable but beneficial. The fourth driver is stress. This one operates through an entirely different mechanism, and it is the one that genuinely shocks people when they learn about it, because it means your blood glucose can spike significantly without eating anything at all. When you are under stress, physical stress, emotional stress, poor sleep, even intense exercise, your body releases cortisol and adrenaline. These hormones are part of your fight or flight response, and one of their primary functions is to rapidly raise blood glucose. Why? Because your body is preparing for action. It needs fuel available immediately, so it instructs the liver to release stored glucose into the bloodstream, a process called gluconeogenesis, even when you have not eaten a single gram of carbohydrate. If you are someone who wakes up with an elevated fasting glucose reading and you cannot understand why, given that you have been fasting all night, this is often the explanation. The dawn phenomenon, a surge in cortisol in the early hours of the morning, causes the liver to release glucose before you have even opened your eyes. Your alarm going off, your morning anxiety, a difficult commute, all of these activate the same stress response, and all of them push glucose higher with no food involved whatsoever. The fifth driver is the order in which you eat your food. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive finding in recent glucose research, and it comes from work published in Diabetes Care. The sequence in which food arrives in your digestive system has a dramatic effect on how sharply glucose rises after a meal. When you eat vegetables and protein first and leave the carbohydrates until last, glucose absorption from those carbohydrates is significantly slower and flatter. When you eat carbohydrates first, bread at the start of a meal for instance, glucose rises steeply because there is nothing in the digestive system to buffer its absorption. The same meal, the same total carbohydrate content, a completely different glucose response based purely on the order in which the food arrived. Really quickly, if you are finding this useful, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps these videos reach more people who need this information. Now, let us keep going. So let me name this directly, because I want it to land clearly. The reason so many people who are eating what they believe is a healthy diet still have unstable blood glucose, unexplained energy crashes, creeping weight gain, and worsening metabolic markers is this: they have been optimizing for the wrong variable. The dietary conversation for decades has been dominated by sugar, the obvious, visible, labeled sugar in sweets and soft drinks and desserts. People have been told to avoid that, and many have. But while attention was focused on the obvious villain, the real drivers of glucose instability were hiding in plain sight. In the morning toast, in the lunchtime wrap, in the freshly squeezed juice that feels like a virtuous choice, in the low-fat yogurt with added fruit, in the stress of a difficult week, in the poor sleep that is quietly elevating cortisol every single night. The food industry has made this considerably worse by creating a category of products that appear metabolically neutral but are anything but. Low-fat products are one of the clearest examples. When fat is removed from food, the taste and texture disappear with it. To compensate, manufacturers add sugar and refined starch. A low-fat flavored yogurt can contain more sugar per serving than a standard biscuit. A low-fat granola bar can spike glucose more steeply than a piece of chocolate because the fat that would have slowed glucose absorption has been removed. People reaching for these products are doing so in good faith. The system failed them, not their choices. Then there is the breakfast problem, which I see reflected in patient after patient. The standard Western breakfast is almost perfectly designed to cause a large glucose spike within 30 minutes of waking. Toast or cereal or porridge made from rolled oats, followed by fruit juice or a smoothie, consumed quickly while rushing out the door. All of that carbohydrate arriving rapidly with minimal protein, minimal fat, minimal fiber to buffer it. Blood glucose climbs steeply, insulin surges, glucose crashes back down by mid-morning. Hunger returns, energy falls, the cycle begins again, and it repeats itself 3 or 4 times a day. Poor blood glucose control does not stay elevated because you lack discipline. It does not stay unstable because you are weak-willed or ignorant or making deliberately bad choices. It stays unstable when the food environment you are living in and the information you have been given was never designed with your metabolic health in mind. The responsibility for that lies with the food system and the public health guidance that failed to look beyond obvious sugar, not with you. So what is the practical path forward? I want to be clear that I am not advocating for extreme carbohydrate restriction or any kind of rigid dietary protocol. I am not suggesting that carbohydrates are the enemy or that everyone needs to follow the same approach. What I am saying is that if you want to stabilize your blood glucose in a meaningful, lasting way, you need to address the actual drivers, not just the obvious ones. And that requires a few specific, evidence-based adjustments. This is the simplest possible intervention, and the evidence behind it is remarkably strong. Research published in Diabetes Care demonstrated that eating vegetables and protein before carbohydrates at the same meal reduced post-meal glucose spikes by up to 37% compared to eating carbohydrates first. The mechanism is straightforward. Protein and fiber slow the rate at which the stomach empties and the rate at which glucose enters the bloodstream. When those buffers are already in place by the time carbohydrate arrives, absorption is dramatically slowed and the glucose curve is significantly flatter. You do not need to eat less. You do not need to change what you are eating, you simply need to change the sequence. Start with salad, vegetables, or a protein source. Finish with the starch. Carbohydrates eaten in isolation produce the steepest glucose spikes. Carbohydrates eaten alongside protein and fat produce a much more gradual, manageable response. The fat slows gastric emptying, the rate at which food leaves the stomach. The protein triggers a hormonal response that improves insulin sensitivity in the short term. Together, they act as a natural glucose buffer for the carbohydrates consumed in the same meal. This is why a piece of toast eaten with eggs and avocado produces a very different glucose response from the same piece of toast eaten with jam. The carbohydrate content is similar. The metabolic outcome is not. Not all carbohydrates are equal in terms of how quickly they are broken down and absorbed. The rate of digestion depends primarily on the structure of the starch and the fiber content of the food. White bread, white rice, and refined cereals are rapidly digested because the fiber has been removed and the starch structure has been broken down by processing. Legumes, sweet potatoes, whole oats, and most whole vegetables are digested much more slowly because their fiber and cellular structure slow the absorption process significantly. Research published in the British Medical Journal found that replacing refined carbohydrates with whole food alternatives that are higher in fiber reduced the risk of type 2 diabetes by up to 20% over long-term follow-up. The mechanism is the glucose flattening effect of intact fiber and slower starch structure. You are not eliminating carbohydrates. You are choosing the versions that your body can handle more gracefully. Given that cortisol and adrenaline raise blood glucose independently of food, addressing chronic stress and poor sleep is not an optional lifestyle choice, it is a metabolic intervention. When cortisol is chronically elevated, the liver is receiving ongoing signals to release glucose. No dietary change will fully compensate for that hormonal background noise. In practical terms, this means protecting sleep as a non-negotiable priority. Research published in The Lancet has shown that just 1 week of restricted sleep, reducing nightly sleep from 8 hours to 5, significantly increases insulin resistance and impairs glucose regulation, even in metabolically healthy adults. A short walk after meals, even 10 minutes, has been shown in multiple studies to reduce post-meal glucose spikes by meaningfully blunting the rise and accelerating clearance. The muscle contractions involved in walking use glucose directly without requiring insulin, which bypasses the insulin resistance that slows normal glucose clearance. I want to be very clear that none of these changes should be used as a reason to stop or alter any prescribed medication without speaking to your doctor first. If you are on metformin or a GLP-1 agonist or any other glucose-lowering medication, those decisions were made for important clinical reasons, and they should be revisited only with your doctor's involvement. What I am saying is that lifestyle changes and medication are not opposites, they are complementary. A patient who stabilizes their diet, reduces their stress, improves their sleep, and moves more regularly will almost always respond better to glucose-lowering medication and may, over time and under medical supervision, require less of it. The biology is not working against the treatment, it is working with it. Let me bring this back to the clinical reality I see on a regular basis because I think it helps to ground everything we have discussed in actual human outcomes. One of the patterns I see repeatedly in the emergency department is patients coming in with acute complications of metabolic disease, diabetic ketoacidosis, severe hypoglycemia from medication overcorrection, acute cardiovascular events in people who are genuinely surprised by their diagnosis. They tell me they thought they were eating reasonably well. They were not consuming large amounts of obvious sugar. They were following what they understood to be a balanced diet. What they had not been told is that the refined starch in their daily meals was producing glucose responses essentially equivalent to eating pure sugar. That no one had explained the role of meal composition, food order, or stress in their glucose levels. That their low-fat food choices had been loaded with carbohydrate to compensate for the removed fat. What is also striking is how quickly the picture can change. I have seen patients who, once they understand the actual drivers of their glucose instability and make targeted changes to their diet and lifestyle, show meaningful improvements in their fasting glucose and HbA1c, the long-term marker of average blood glucose, within 6 to 12 weeks. Not because they went on a restrictive diet, but because they stopped targeting the wrong things and started addressing the actual mechanisms. The body is remarkably responsive when you give it the conditions it needs to regulate itself correctly. Blood glucose instability is not a standalone problem. It is one of the earliest and most visible signs that your metabolic system is under sustained pressure, and the mechanisms that drive chronic glucose elevation, insulin resistance, cortisol dysregulation, endothelial inflammation, visceral fat accumulation are the same mechanisms that drive cardiovascular disease, hypertension, non-alcoholic fatty liver 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 disease, hypertension, hypertension, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, 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 polycystic ovary syndrome, certain cancers, and cognitive decline. Research published in Nature Medicine has shown that metabolic dysfunction, the cluster of conditions that includes insulin resistance, elevated fasting glucose, and central obesity, is now present in the majority of adults in the United States and is rapidly increasing across the developed world. This is not a genetic story. The human genome has not changed in 50 years. The food environment has, the stress load has, the sleep patterns have. What we are seeing is a population-wide metabolic response to a set of conditions that human biology was never designed to operate in permanently. When you address the root cause of glucose instability, when you start eating in a way that works with your hormonal system rather than against it, that protects your sleep, that manages your stress load, you are not just improving a single marker on a blood test, you are reducing your risk across the full spectrum of chronic disease. You are protecting the health of your blood vessels, your kidneys, your brain, and your heart simultaneously. That is a far bigger prize than any single number on a lab report. So let me bring this full circle. Blood glucose is not spiking in most people primarily because of the obvious visible sugar in sweets and soft drinks. It is spiking because of refined starch that is metabolized just as fast, because of fruit juice stripped of its fiber, because of low-fat processed foods loaded with carbohydrate, because of stress that instructs the liver to release glucose without a single bite of food, because of meal patterns and food sequences that were never designed with metabolic health in mind, and because of advice that focused on the wrong villain for 50 years. The solution is not to eat less, or to restrict yourself harshly, or to live in fear of food. It is to understand the actual mechanisms driving your glucose and make targeted, informed changes based on that understanding. Eat your vegetables and protein first. Pair your carbohydrates with fat and fiber. Choose whole food starches over refined ones. Protect your sleep. Move after meals. These are not difficult changes, but they are the right ones because they address what is actually happening inside your body. Glucose instability does not persist because you have failed. It persists when no one has given you the right information to address the right causes. That ends here. If you found this video useful, please like and subscribe to the channel and help this information reach more people who need it.